Itamaraty freaks out upon learning that Trump used the Maduro effect against Lula. Because now, the shock doesn't come from behind-the-scenes rumors. It comes from an official document sent to the Chamber of Deputies and signed by Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira.
But it's not just the tariff package that's causing concerns here for the Brazilian government, right, my friend? We also know that Itamaraty has spoken out about fears that criminal gangs in Brazil could be classified as terrorist organizations. This understanding by the American authorities, besides the tariff package, what is Itamaraty anticipating or fearing about this?
Fearing a military action by the United States on Brazilian territory. Bia, this is information that I'm reporting in my column. Today on the Jovem Pan website, I want to invite our listeners, viewers, and internet users to visit www.jovempan.com.br. Who's joining us on the screen? We show that the Itamaraty admits the risk of a military action by the United States in Brazil because of the PCC and the Comando Vermelho. This official document was sent to the Chamber of Deputies by our country's foreign ministry, Itamaraty. It explicitly acknowledges the fear that the United States could classify the Primeiro Comando da Capital, the PCC, and the Comando Vermelho as terrorist organizations could pave the way for American extraterritorial actions, including military ones, in Brazilian territory.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs acknowledged that classifying the Primeiro Comando da Capital and the Comando Vermelho as terrorist organizations by the United States could open the door to extraterritorial actions against Brazilian institutions, companies, and citizens, including the risk of military force being used against national territory. The political weight lies precisely in the fact that Lula's own government admits in writing that Brazilian organized crime has become an international problem. The government complains about sovereignty when Washington tightens the grip, but avoids facing the fact that sovereignty also dies. When factions rule neighborhoods, expel families, impose fear, and control territories where the state has disappeared, as Itamaraty has admitted. I'll tell you all about this in a moment. If you like this kind of straightforward and no-nonsense content, consider subscribing, because here we have videos like this every day. The response sent to the chamber was the result of an information request submitted by Congressman Ever Vieira de Mello from the Republicanos Party in Espírito Santo. The document reached the legislature with the signature of Mauro Vieira and dealt directly with the Brazilian government's position regarding the American decision to classify Brazilian criminal factions as terrorist organizations. Itamaraty stated that it did not receive prior formal communication from the United States about the intention to classify the Primeiro Comando da Capital and the Comando Vermelho in that category. Even so, the ministry acknowledged that it opposes the measure and believes it could bring economic impacts and impacts on Brazil's sovereignty to Brazil.
In our column at Jovem Pan, we even present the full document and the excerpt that is mentioned. Exactly this concern from Mauro Vieira, the Brazilian foreign minister who signed this document and sent it to the Chamber of Deputies. According to him, this text does represent a more direct statement from Lula's government about the risks of this unilateral measure recently announced by the White House in Washington. And we've been following all this controversy here in Jovem Pan's journalism for quite some time. I myself have been covering all the developments throughout our programming over the past few months, both from Brazilians with the American government and from the American government itself, more specifically from the State Department, which is headed by Marco Rubio. Regarding this situation, for months, we at Jovem Pan Journalism had already mapped out this possibility, pointed out this possibility, and had already been discussing this issue. Every time this happened, there was always a denial from the Brazilian government that this could happen. And now, this document, dated July 1st but only released today in the system of the Chamber of Deputies there in Brazil, shows that this is indeed a concern. Therefore, it is official. The Brazilian government, Lula's government, in a document, they point to a possibility of military action by the United States. There in Brazil, because of this designation of the PCC and Comando Vermelho from criminal organizations to terrorist organizations,
the concern is clear. From the moment Washington places these factions under the terrorism label, the American government gains tougher tools to act outside its borders. Mauro Vieira wrote that the classification could be used as a justification for extraterritorial actions against Brazilian institutions, especially in the financial, immigration, and criminal justice spheres. The strongest part came right after, when the document acknowledged the risk of the use of United States military force against the national territory. This point put Brasilia on alert because the classification does not depend on Brazilian authorization. For the American government, the decision is unilateral. Brazil can disagree, complain, try to negotiate, and strengthen diplomacy. But it does not have sole control over the legal and political effect of a designation made in Washington. That's where the Maduro effect comes into play, after the American operation that captured Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela on January 3, 2026. The Lula administration came to realize that Trump doesn't use this kind of framing just as rhetoric. This move didn't come out of nowhere. Before that, Senator Flávio Bolsonaro had said that he asked Donald Trump to classify the Primeiro Comando da Capital and Comando Vermelho as terrorist organizations. Lula, on the other hand, presented the United States with arguments against the measure. The difference between the two sides became clear.
I will be the first to use the word in a public hearing where I will present the arguments, both technical and political, as well, showing that possible tariffs are bad for Brazil, but they're also bad for the United States. I will defend PIX, which was created during President Bolsonaro's administration and promoted the inclusion of millions of Brazilians in the banking system.
The problem for Lula is that the word sovereignty doesn't erase the real control of organized crime in parts of Brazil. Itamaraty is now alarmed by a possible foreign intervention. But ordinary Brazilians have lived for years under the daily actions of factions that operate as a parallel power. The government's response says that public security, intelligence, and justice agencies took part in the internal assessment and concluded that classifying these factions as terrorists would not bring concrete benefits to international cooperation. The official argument is that treating them as transnational criminal organizations would already allow for information exchange, asset seizure, asset recovery, and combating money laundering. But Washington's reaction indicates that the United States sees the problem differently, not just as trafficking, but as a broad, violent, and internationalized threat. There are concerns. The approval from Itamaraty also has a financial dimension. A designation linked to terrorism can freeze assets, restrict transactions, and require companies subject to American jurisdiction to cut ties with people or entities connected to the groups. The warning affects people under investigation and any structure that could be seen as a bridge, even indirectly, to faction money. Crime, which once seemed distant from foreign trade, now appears as a risk to entire sectors. The effort in Washington moved forward another way. At the same time, Paulo Figueiredo, an ally of Eduardo Bolsonaro in the United States, asked the Trump administration to suspend the heavy tariffs on Brazilian imports and redirect the pressure toward individual sanctions against federal Supreme Court justices using instruments like the Magnitsky Act. The logic behind the request is simple. General tariffs affect Brazilian producers and American consumers. Individual sanctions target authorities accused of judicial abuses.
What is Paulo Figueiredo proposing? Here's what he says. Let's switch. He suggests that the American government switch from imposing those 25% tariffs on Brazilian products for sanctions on authorities, on Supreme Court justices. And then why does he say that? So let's swap the 25 tariff, which will harm innocent people, and let's apply the Magnitsky Act and the cancellation of visas for the Supreme Court justices' family members. And which ministers? This time he goes a little further than what has already happened. He suggests applying the Magnitsky Act to Justice Alexandre de Moraes, his wife, Viviane Barsi, who is a lawyer, and also to the justices on the Supreme Federal Court's first panel. We're talking about Justice Carmen Lucia, Cristiano Zanin, Alexandre de Moraes, and Flavio Dino. And he also adds Justice Gilmar Mendes.
It's a powerful tool because it turns a political punishment into financial isolation. Brazilian diplomacy understood that under Trump, certain classifications can go beyond theory and produce real consequences. The selective silence of Lula's government increases political tension. When the pressure comes from outside, the Planalto talks about sovereignty, when the control comes from criminal gangs. Within the communities, the response is usually slow, bureaucratic, and insufficient.
Justice Gilmar Mendez, for another reason, because of Operation Car Wash, for defending it and taking part in undoing it.
They explain this in the document because Gilmar Mendes is the justice who gives political support to Alexandre de Moraes. And in fact, Gilmar Mendes is the Dean of the Supreme Federal Court. And he is not only the Dean, but also the justice who gives the most interviews, who usually has the most dialogue with the political world, and who supports Alexandre de Moraes, and who also works to protect him, to shield the Supreme Court from attacks by political opponents.
The document, signed by Mauro Vieira, ended up revealing more than diplomacy wanted to admit. The concern is not just about Trump, the concern is about the fact that Brazil has lost control over part of its own reality. And now a foreign power is using this gap to justify pressure. The next strain on the presidency won't come just from the opposition in Congress, it will come from the question that the document placed at the center of the debate. Why does the Brazilian government fear the American reaction so much against criminal gangs that terrorize Brazilians every day? True sovereignty begins when citizens can live without asking criminals for permission. Thank you very much for watching this video until the end. Support our project and contribute financially through the Pix key that appears on your screen. We are an independent channel dedicated to telling you the truth and keeping you informed. Your contribution helps us keep going.